Hello. I'm sure everybody can see me and hear me. Um, Welcome to the APHG exam prep webinar. This is a resource of the American Geographical Society through our Geography Educators Initiative. And this is basically a webinar, a space for APHG teachers community to come together and learn and share tips and resources to students for the upcoming APHG exam scheduled for May 5th. I believe so. My name is Stella Maris, talking to you, and I am currently the manager of sponsored projects here at AGS. And with me today, I have an amazing panel of experts, APHG expertism, who will each spend up to at least 20 minutes presenting, enriching us on tips and strategies that will help our students perform better in this year's APHG exam that we're preparing for. Next slide. Yes, that's me. That's my face. Yes, and that's my A team. Today we will go through the task verbs with Dr. Lisa. We will go through the MRQ basics with Mr. Kevin, and a general review of human geography with Miss Annalisa. Next slide. Yes. So before we dive deep into our webinar, I would take just a little bit of a few minutes to just share a little background in case one of us is new to this platform and they wish to learn more about where this webinar comes from. If you're not familiar with the AGS, AGS is the American Geographical Society, and it's a 21st century learning society dedicated to advancement of geographical learning, knowledge, understanding through across business, government, academia, social sector, and importantly, building the community of APHG teachers and students. Established in 1851, it is one of the oldest professional geographic organizations in the US, and it's continuously prioritizing supporting the global community of the advanced placement in human geography teachers. And it's dedicated to creating generous educators, just like the panel we have today, and yourselves joining on this webinar today, that will enrich a community of young people that is well advanced and knowledgeable about geographic education, decision making, and literature in the entire human geography environment and all the discourse that goes around the world dynamically. So we take our long-standing commitment to you, the teachers, and we pride in that on always providing these resources and continuously checking in on with you voluntarily, but also with the commitment of the advisory board, the amazing advisory board that we do have. And I am happy to say that 2 of our panelists today are part of the Geography Educator Initiative Advisory Board. The AGS also provides plenty of resources, more than just the webinar. We have the GeoBoost grants, and these go out to teachers to be able to support and enhance education within their classrooms. We have the daily Geo and newsletter. We have the webinar, just like this one that we have. We are curating more material regarding the open source environment, mainly through OpenStreetMap trainings. If you've been participating, definitely you've had some of the mapathons or map activism engagements going around, and a lot more is coming, and we're interested in having your ideas come through. We're interested in building with you as a team, and definitely through our teacher advisory board, which is our uniform voice for improving the Geography Educator Initiative. We launched the Geography Educator Insider, which is our monthly newsletter that you will see probably every end of each month or early each month, just to highlight the new adventures and the new content that the AGS has delivered through the APHG community and the contributions of our resources that we do have. Next slide, please. Yes, so before I introduce our panelist team officially, I would just like to do some housekeeping. Please make sure that you share. We have a Q&A box at the bottom of your webinar screen. Please utilize it and share any questions that you do have through the presentations. You will be able to receive a survey at the end of the webinar. Please, we appreciate your answers and take time to help us understand how effective this engagement has been. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is our A team. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Lisa Benton-Short, who is a professor of geography and a program director for sustainability at JW, George Washington University. She has a wealth of research, a wealth of knowledge in the entire human geography and geographical environment as well, including urban sustainability, globalization, to mention but a few. She's well resourceful and so enriched in this environment. And she has authored multiple papers, multiple resources that we can all utilize and enrich ourselves. Dr. Lisa has over 30 years of experience to all this that I have just said. And I'm proud to say that she's AGS's closest friend and ally, and we're proud of that. We are super grateful for that, Dr. Lisa, and we continue to appreciate your efforts to enhancing the APHG community overall. Mr. Kevin Tanner is our APHG Teacher Advisory Board member. Yes, and he's a teacher at Spanish River Community High School. He'll be able to introduce himself from where he's joining from. And also we have Miss Annalisa, who is also our teacher advisory board member. And we're so grateful for the commitment and opportunity they provide with the AGS to ensure that we do have growth and increased capacity within the APHG exam environment, and also breeding a future generation of leaders that are really competent and well informed within the discourse of human geography and how it influences change in the environment. Yes. Okay, I guess at this moment, I'll just give it away to you, Dr. Lisa, to take us through what you prepared for us in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you
Over to you, Dr. Lisa.
Thank you, Stella Maris, for a wonderful introduction. And let me just first say thank you to those teachers who are here, who have given up some time in their afternoon when a precious time is precious, and I know that. And for those of you who will watch this as a recorded, we hope that this provides some of some guidance around helping you all prepare your students. So one of the biggest messages I want to leave you with today is that all of us that participate in AP Human Geography, whether we're the high school teachers, whether we're the higher ed faculty that attend the readings, we want your students to succeed. We would love it if all students who took this exam earned a 5. So we are committed to advancing the strength of our students, their capacity to think geographically, and to show us that they have really mastered some of the material. So next slide, Nicole. So what I want to do is just very quickly do a review of the AP Human Geography task verbs. Now, many of you have been teaching these task verbs for the whole academic year, but I wanted to bring them to your attention because these are the only task verbs that your students will see on this exam. Okay, in both multiple choice questions and in the free response or FRQs, they will only see these 5 task verbs. So hopefully they have encountered these task verbs before. But I did want to spend a few minutes talking about kind of the threshold for earning points, because I know that's a really important topic, and you can certainly work on that over the next couple of weeks before the exam. So the first task verb is identify. Those are generally entry-level points. We really expect most students to be successful at answering questions that ask them to identify. Usually in a free response question, an identify task verb will be one of the first questions or prompts that a student sees in the FRQ. A second task verb is define. Again, this is an entry-level point. This is simply being able to provide the definition of a key process, a key concept, a model, a theory. And again, those are entry-level task verbs. Then we get into task verb number 3, which is describe. This is to provide a characteristic of something. And depending on the type of question that is asked, describe can either be an entry level or it can be a proficient in terms of task verb. The two that I want to highlight and spend a little bit more time on today are compare and explain. These are the two task verbs that tend to be in the advanced category. Sometimes they may be proficient, but most of the time your students are going to encounter them as an advanced task, an advanced skill level on the exam, both in terms of multiple choice questions as well as FRQs. Next slide. So let me start with compare. And I'm taking some lessons that we learned from one of the FRQs from the 2022 exam last year. One of the challenges that we see students struggling with in terms of earning the full points for answering a compare task verb is that they oftentimes don't close the loop. So let me give you an example of what I mean by closing the loop. So I'm going to take a part of one of the prompts from one of the FRQs from the West Coast exam. And the prompt was, using the data shown in the graph, compare the trends in forest cover change between more developed countries and less developed countries from 1990 through 2015. Okay, so you can see that they're asked to compare two things: what's happening in trends in developed countries and what's happening in the trends in less developed countries. And there were 5 or 6 countries listed in this task that were on the graph. Your students may also see compare phrased as explain one similarity or explain one difference between the theories of, say, Rostow and Wallerstein, to use a FRQ from way back in the past, right? So they might not see compare explicitly mentioned, but because they're being asked to explain a similarity or a difference between two things, that is a comparison task, okay? And when I say close the loop, we are expecting student responses that earn a point to say something about both. So you cannot just talk about a main idea of Rostow and not talk about Wallerstein, okay? You can't just say something about the trends in developed countries and not say something about trends in less developed countries. So next slide. So here's an example of two, I kind of modified some existing answers, but as you can see, here's the answers to that prompt that asked them to use the data shown in the graph, compare the trends in forest cover change between more developed and less developed countries. So one answer was given: forest area is decreasing more rapidly in less developed countries due to the fact that they are developing more rapidly, which also causes deforestation. So the good news is that the student tried to provide a good explanation for why forest areas were declining in less developed countries. This response did not earn a point because they didn't close the loop. They didn't tell us what the trends were in more developed countries. So answer B does do that. So let's read that out. As shown in the graph, more developed countries' percentages stayed mostly the same. This includes the United States, Germany, Japan, and Germany. However, less developed countries like Honduras, Indonesia, and Brazil's percentages increasingly declined. So this response did earn a point. You may think, well, did they have to mention the United States, Japan, and Germany as more developed countries to earn the point? No, they did not. But by doing that, they also really showed us that they knew when they were looking at the graph, which countries belonged in which categorization. Next slide. So I do want to spend a few minutes talking about the explain task verb, because this is one of the most challenging task verbs. And on the left-hand side of the graph, you can see one of the questions from the East Coast exam that is looking at urbanization indicators for selected countries. So this is last year's urbanization question. And what I really want to draw your attention to are all the explains that are highlighted in red, right? So this is a 7-part FRQ. And by the way, all FRQs are 7 points. 95% of the time, they are going to be parts A through G. It's possible an FRQ could have parts A through F if one of the prompts had them do 2 separate things or do something to 2 different processes. But likely your students are always going to see 7-part FRQs, right? So out of the 7, you can see we start with an entry-level point, identify, but part B is explain one difference. So here is a comparison task, but it is phrased as an explain one difference in urbanization patterns between Australia and Bangladesh. So that was one way in which we see compare essentially being asked. Part C says describe, probably an entry-level point, but D, E, F, and G are all explain, right? They are both counting as the proficient skills and the advanced skills. So if you think about it, out of a 7-part FRQ, your students would have 7 explanations to provide to earn points. That is a significant amount, and it really means that for students to score a 3, 4, or 5, they are going to have to be successful in the explain task verbs, right? Now, some of the advanced explain task verbs are going to be the difference between the 4s and 5s, but for students to earn 3s, they are going to have to answer explains. So again, what we have found over the last few years, so this is not just in 2022, but it's been a common challenge, is that most students do not sufficiently answer explain task verbs. They often stop short of giving us a full explanation that earns a point. So as I'm thinking about it from your perspective, I'm sure you have some strategies that you do to encourage your students to really write for those explain points, right? And I think whatever kind of additional support you can give your students on explain over the next few weeks, that's where I would really invest some time in the classroom as you're preparing, right? Because chances are your students are already really comfortable with identify, define, and maybe even describe. But now that you see how often explain and compare are going to show up on our FRQs in particular, it's really to your students' benefit to feel more and more comfortable answering explain tasks. Next slide. So the challenge is your students are going to see explain phrased very differently. And these are really important phrases to get your students comfortable seeing, right? They might see explain why, they might see explain how, they might say a task verb might be something like explain one way in which. And then I want to draw your attention to the last 4 ways that explain is phrased. Explain the strength of a theory, a model, or a process. Number 5, explain the limitation or weakness of a theory or process. 6, explain the limitation of the stimulus, the data in the table, this photograph, this map, for example. And then number 7, explain the degree to which. Now, I should say that explain phrased as explain the strength, the limitation, or explain the degree, these are all advanced skills. But again, this is where your 4 and 5s come from. So we want our students to earn those 5s on the exam. They need to feel comfortable and understand what's expected of explain a strength or explain the limitation, or particularly explain the degree to which. Next slide. So let me talk about explain the limitation. One of the things that we do as geographers is that we teach processes, we teach concepts, we teach about geographic data, we teach them about the power of maps. Hopefully you're also teaching about the limitations of maps, the limitations of data, the problems that we have with some of our forms of analysis or our theories or our models, right? And that's really why this is an advanced higher level thinking task verb, because a student has to really grasp and almost master the concept to be able to really see its weak point, to see what it cannot do, right? So for example, from that urbanization question that I had highlighted all of the five different explain task verbs, one of the parts of the question said, explain the limitation of the data shown in the table in illustrating challenges to urban sustainability, right? So there are many limitations of that data. That's the great thing about some of these limitations, is that, there's numerous possible answers. But what we were looking for in an explanation that would earn that point is for them to be able to recognize that some data is really missing from that table that would be necessary to really understand some of the challenges around urban sustainability. So they would have to first really know the concept, be able to, in their own minds, define urban sustainability, to be able to say what's missing in this data that I would need to make sure that I could talk about some of the challenges around urban sustainability. So possible answers to this include there's no data on environmental components of sustainability. For example, air quality was not a part of the table. The percentage of urban sprawl or suburbanization was not part of the data in the table. There was no information on climate change, on greenhouse gas emissions, or anything like that. And so that's a really important part of sustainability that wasn't present in that table, right? There was also the other E's of sustainability that were missing. There was data missing on economic components like percentage of poverty or cost of living, or the percentage in the informal economy. And there was even equity issues. There wasn't anything on gender or other kinds of inequalities that might exist. So one of the challenges you have is that the limitations or the weaknesses of data or stimuli are really important, because we want students to see that they exist within the geographic perspective, and it really is something that is a higher level task verb. Next slide. Probably the task verb which we see the most struggling with is the explain the degree to which. And one of the reasons why is because this is a relatively new way of phrasing an explain task, right? So you don't really see explain the degree to which appearing much before the 2021 exam. And so I think that for both teachers and students, they're not quite sure what this really requires them to do. So I want to make that hopefully a little bit more clear today. So this is really skills 2E and 5D. These are our highest level skills. And also explain the degree to which opens the opportunity for a student who really knows their material to make different arguments depending on how they support this argument, okay? So in a very short but important articulation here, responses must make an assertion as to the level or degree. They must indicate high degree, moderate degree, or low degree, followed by a statement that supports that assertion, okay? So last year, did we see students saying high degree, moderate degree? Oh, heck no, we did not. We worked with them though. We gave it a go. We were like sort of high, a lot, substantial, significant. We were taking a lot of adjectives there, and we were also trying to read through the entire response to see whether we could infer a degree. But that's going to tighten up this year, and we really are expecting students to make some assertion as to the degree, right? So let's give 2 examples. Explain the degree. So this comes from the East Coast exam, FRQ number 3, which had the 2 maps, one map of the political boundaries of Africa, the other of the cultural groups of Africa. And this part of the question was explain the degree to which colonization affected the languages spoken in present-day Africa. So here is one answer that did earn a point. Colonization affected the languages spoken to a high degree because European languages often became the lingua franca or official languages and are still widely spoken as second languages. So this is a very good example of a 1-sentence explain. I would caution that most explanations probably need 2 to 3 sentences, and that's what I would encourage your students to write. But what I like about this response, and the reason why it earned a point, is you can see that it explicitly said to what degree, right? We are asking the students to tell us to what degree this is true or not true, and they have to tell us it's, a degree. Because the student could have also answered completely differently. So if you look at the second response, it says colonialization affected the languages spoken to a low degree or no degree, because many indigenous languages remain dominant languages in many African countries, right? So we can't infer what degree your student is answering if they don't tell us, because they could have written colonialization affected the languages, and there are many indigenous languages that remain dominant languages. It doesn't tell us the degree to which that is true or not, right? So we will continue to try and work with your students, but the more you can get them to be explicit in addressing the degree and asserting that degree, the more successful they're going to be in this task verb. And I should say, explain the degree to which appeared on all 3 FRQs. It is a higher level advanced thinking, but you can count on it appearing at least twice in the FRQ section of the exam, right? Next slide. So wrapping up, I hope you've already had your students practice mapping, practice interpreting maps. We're still seeing some students not always reading legends carefully, not always looking carefully at the maps, not always reading graphs and tables carefully. Those are oftentimes really important, especially in the FRQ section, right? So there are always going to be 3 FRQs. FRQ 1 will have no stimulus, right? But FRQ 2 will have 1 stimulus always. And usually that could be a map, a table, a chart. FRQ 3 will always have 2 stimuli, 2 maps, a table, a map, 2 photographs, right? So in fact, 2 out of 3 of the FRQs are about interpreting maps and other kinds of visual stimulus. 2, remind your students to read parts of the question carefully and to answer the question, right? I know they have a lot to do in those FRQs and they're tempted to kind of race through, but we don't want them to race through and misread or misinterpret a question. So we did see sometimes students who are answering the question incorrectly because they had read developing countries instead of developed countries. Teach students to answer those parts of the questions that specify use of the stimulus. So in every FRQ where your student must go to the stimulus to answer the question, we will tell them that. They will see something like based on the table shown, or using the data from the graph, or based on the images above, the map 1. When your students see that, that is a cue that the answer to this question lies in their interpretation of the stimulus, okay? And that will happen 2 to 3 times in an FRQ2 or an FRQ3. Finally, work with your students to find those limitations, strengths, and weaknesses. Now that you've covered most of the course, one of your exam review strategies could be, let's start thinking, you already know these concepts. Let's think about the weaknesses of these concepts. That might be a great strategy. And then 5, I'm going to leave you with one idea. Please have your students label the parts of the question like you see in my fake FRQ answer to the right. It is absolutely okay for them to skip lines in between parts. I wouldn't suggest skipping lines in the actual answers, but in between parts of the FRQ, they can skip a line. If they label the parts, they can also go out of order. So if they feel more comfortable answering part A, part B, and part E first, and then going on to C, D, and F, as long as they are labeling those parts, your students are, it will help the readers when they go to score that question immensely. Our readers will always work with your student responses, but the more you can help make it obvious what the student is answering, the more chance that we can make sure they have earned their points. If we get a paragraph and everything's out of order, and it's a 7-part question and they're starting with an answer to part G, and we don't know this because they're just writing in a paragraph form, it is likely that it's going to be difficult for us to keep track of all the points that are earned on that part of their answer. So please do have them label the parts of the question. And that's me, and I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. Next slide.
All right, thank you so much, Chief. That was a fantastic presentation, very helpful. I know when I do APSIs, AP Summer Institutes, Lisa's always very kind to share many of those same topics about the 5 verbs. And I really think it helps students to perform better on the exam, which again, as she alluded to, it's what we all want. We really need geographical education nowadays with these students, in addition to all of the other compelling subjects that are out there. So I'm coming to you live on location from Spanish River High School in Boca Raton, Florida, where we don't have old people in Boca, as many of you may think. We have the old people's parents. But we're here. I didn't think I would get home in time. Annalisa was able to get out of school and get home. I'm still here. But my task today is to talk about the multiple choice section of the exam, what we would refer to as the MCQ section of the test, as opposed to the FRQs, which are the free response questions. Important to note that the test is equally weighted between those 2 parts, 60 points on the multiple choice side for the 60 questions, and then also 60 points for the FRQs. And each of those are equally weighted at about 20 points. If you figure 7 task verbs, like the Chief talked about, 2.85 or so points for everything that they can do. So in talking about the MCQs, as you can see, I'm a big proponent of the course and exam description, and especially the stuff that College Board has provided us. If you have not yet done the deep dive into AP Classroom, AP Daily, just so much stuff that's there. And especially if you're a teacher new to our discipline, really dig into that CED and you'll find everything there is to know about the exam. This is really an exercise in transparency. We want you as the educator to know how the test is constructed and designed, because we want you to be able to impart to your students how they can be more successful, demonstrating that they have learned the topics, the content, but as well that they can practice and master the skills. Because as you look through that CED, you'll see it's all about topic and skill format. There's even a short MCQ practice set that's towards the back of the CED. I believe it's page 160. It says it there in the slideshow. And that is where you'll find some questions that you can use with your students. Perhaps you do it as a little pre-test, post-test. That's what I do. But there's also longer exams. In fact, there's even an exam from 2020 that was a practice test. It was never a given exam. It was never a released exam. So those of us that have been around the block once or twice, there's not that beautiful statistical conversion chart to go to, but you can reasonably approximate how many multiple choice questions you would need to get right to earn a 3, earn a 4, earn a 5. Many of those things are available through the College Board website. As I mentioned, it's half of the students' score. They have those 60 multiple choice items. They're going to have 1 hour to do that. And of course, that is one huge strategy that I'll talk about at the end of my presentation, and that is the timeliness with which students are working on this multiple choice section. All of our items, which, you know, in many moons ago, when I worked as part of the team that was constructing some of these multiple choice questions, we would always refer to them as items. There are 5 answer options. All right, so A through E, we know that the answer options always have one or more distractors that students are going to tell you there's more than one right answer, because often there are distractors that may answer a question that's not being asked. There may be something about the answer that has maybe one key word that is incorrect or that doesn't apply. Maybe it's at the wrong scale of analysis. There's all kinds of ways that we can create distractors. And it's important, I think, for you to tell your students, as a way to boost their confidence, a good question and good sets of answers should never trick a well-prepared student into a bad answer. But at the same time, we are trying to differentiate not just students who earn college credit from those who don't, but in order to start to differentiate those students who are earning a 4 versus a 5, you better believe there are going to be some questions out there that even the so-called experts may have to really seriously consider. It's also important to note that we do have a lot of parallels within our questions. You'll see perhaps 2 short and 3 long answers. You may see 2 answers that have similar vocabulary terms and then 3 other answers with a different type of term. We generally try to build the parallels, and that's one strategy students might take advantage of as well. Sometimes you can start to look for the parallels, and then you might be able to say, well, I know it's not these 2, it's got to be one of these 3. As the chief alluded to about the FRQs, the same thing with the MCQ format. We have a lot of visual stimuli throughout the test. And this is something where, if you look at the AP exam and the evolution of our test over time, we've done a much better job of presenting students with maps, charts, graphs, landscape photos. You may see a street scene. You may see an aerial photograph, a distantiated perspective of a rice farm in Southeast Asia. So we're presenting students with opportunities to analyze the stimulus and then answer questions. It's important to note that the answer to each of these type of questions has to come from the stimulus. The stimulus is never there as artistic value. It's there because there's something compelling about the stimulus that the student should be using to arrive at their answer. Also, there are what we would call item sets. So instead of standalone questions, which of course that's still the majority of the exam, you'll see several times throughout the test 2 and maybe even 3 items where they use the same stimulus and they kind of flow in a very logical progression, as the chief mentioned, from emerging difficulty to the proficient or moderate level, all the way up to those advanced degree of difficulty questions where, again, we're trying to differentiate between those high performers at that point. It's very important too. This is something that changed a few years back. There's no penalty for guessing. It is to the student's best interest to answer every single question. And particularly when I talk about time, I'll come back to this idea about not worrying about losing any points for guessing in that sense. Nicole, could you take me to my next slide? Thank you so much. So again, weighting the test by unit, this is literally ripped straight out of the CED. We have 7 units of study in our course. The only unit that is slightly underrepresented amongst the MCQs would be that unit 1. But as we sometimes like to say, the skills and topics of unit 1 are embedded throughout the remainder of the course. So even though there may not be something that is purely a unit 1 question, you still might see things like site, situation, basic terminology that we talk about, say scale of analysis. You'll see those things embedded throughout the rest of the exam. But again, in 60 questions, you figure somewhere 8 or 9 questions per unit, and then another 5 or 6 or so from unit 1. And that is the exam weighting by unit. So tell students, even if they've got that bogey unit that they, they really struggled with throughout the year, it's not the end of the world. You can still earn a great score on this exam, even missing 6, 8, 10, 15 questions, you can still earn a college credit score. This is not one of those exams where, students are so conditioned. Oh, I've got to get 99% to get an A or something like that. This is one of those things where if they can do reasonably well across the board, they've got a great shot to earn college credit. All right, Nicole, can you take me to the next slide there? And this is similarly expressed, but now it's the multiple choice questions by the particular skill. And if you go into your CED, you're going to notice that for every single topic page, right? Topic 3.4, topic 7.1, you're going to see that there is a topic presented, the content of our course, and it'll be married to a particular skill. And that skill could be any of those task verbs that the chief told us about. It could be a describe. It could be an explain the degree to which, my personal favorite. And you'll see that from the MCQ perspective, it is heavily skewed towards skill category 1, which is vocabulary driven. You're going to see that key terms are not only embedded in the stem of the questions that we're creating for students. Very often you'll see that key terms represent the distractors and the available answer options, sometimes even to the point where you'll see words like agglomeration, acculturation, assimilation as answer options, because again, it's kind of like that play on words where, the students have to be able to differentiate words that might look alike, words that might sound alike, but mean different things within our course and exam description. But you're going to see that all of the other skills are there, but to a lesser degree. It's really heavily skewed onto the concept and process portion. All right, next slide, please. So I wanted to show you kind of 3 examples. And as we have talked about several times already, both the chief and myself, an emerging difficulty question, a moderately proficient question, and then an advanced, fetal position on the floor, kind of a difficulty question. And a long time ago, the exam used to be set up where the easier ones were kind of skewed to the front of the test and the hardest ones were kind of in the last 20 or so. It's very important for kids to know that those are going to be mixed throughout. So again, when talking about time, every question's worth the same 1 point. Don't spend more than a minute on any single item. Or if you do spend more time, make sure that you're seeing all of the questions because that's a big boost to your score. So in this case, we have a question that's basically a describe verb, pretty straightforward. It's asking about a consequent boundary. We know that there is, one of the topics in Unit 4, Political Geography, that talks about the different types of boundaries and gives all kinds of examples and definitions and those kinds of things. Well, a very well-prepared student would see the word consequent boundary and know, all right, this has to be a boundary that happened because of something else, had to be a consequence. We know that there are also boundaries that are geometric or superimposed, or they are antecedent, they came before people were there. Well, look at your answer options. You've got a relic boundary in A because the Berlin Wall is no longer evident. You've got the superimposed boundaries in B, which is reminiscent of the FRQ that the chief was telling us about with the African boundaries and the cultural groups. You've got a Canadian boundary with the US at the 49th parallel before it was settled. There's your antecedent option. Now you've got your correct answer at D. Canada created Nunavut because they wanted to give greater autonomy to the first Americans who lived in that part of Canada. And then, of course, you've got your distractor at E. The Andes Mountains are a political boundary because they are physically dividing the Andes Mountains, separating those two territories. So again, this is a very straightforward question for a student who's rock solid with the vocab and can easily see, even though those vocab words don't necessarily exist on the page, they're pretty apparent if you're prepared and if you know the vocabulary. Next slide, please. So this next one takes us up into that moderately difficult question. And this one does have a visual stimulus for it. But Nicole, I'm going to ask you, hold on just a second. Let's not look at the picture yet. But it does talk about the illustration in the model. And what you're going to see here is a very easy schematic of bid rent theory and this generalized idea that land closer to the downtown area, the central business district, is more expensive and land that's farther away becomes cheaper. And so this question is asking students to explain. So immediately my verb level's a little bit harder here. And we're going to explain the cost and distance relationship. So this is actually not just the skill 1, which would be the concepts and processes. This is skill 2, where we start talking about relationships, you know, this and that, and how do they work together? Be careful. Sometimes the relationship is there isn't a relationship. So students have to be ready for that sometimes as well. But here, what we see is that if you look at A and B, these are great examples of parallelisms. We've got land more expensive in the suburbs versus land that's cheaper in the CBD. These two answers basically are kind of opposites of each other. And it's important to recognize that both of them are factually incorrect. So a good student, even though this is a little harder than the first one, they should be able to see that, you know, you've got a great parallel there. Both of these are going to be wrong because the land value is not correctly stated. When you start going down into some of the other distractors at the bottom there, people don't live in the CBD because of the traffic congestion. You have to be careful. Sometimes an answer may start out to be correct, but then there's something about it that makes it wrong. Lack of amenities, no museums, no restaurants. We know that's not true of downtown areas. So that's what makes D wrong. Population density does not increase with the distance from the CBD. It actually decreases because you've got mom, dad, 2 kids and a dog living in that typical suburban home. That's going to be a low density gradient as opposed to apartments and condos and things like that in the central business district area because land is expensive. So we're going to build up instead of out. So you arrive at that best answer where it says the lower cost of the land from the CBD makes it affordable for single family homes. Nicole, go ahead and show them the picture then of the model. And again, this is something where it's great to get your kids to practice with these visual stimuli, not just for the FRQs as the chief mentioned, but you're going to see, you know, a good portion, 18 to 24 items on the test are going to have some of these visual stimulus where, again, the student would need to revert back to the picture to be able to help them answer the question. And so what you would see is suburban single family homes out there in rings 4 and 5 and talking about people with high incomes who can afford these expensive homes. But as I like to say out here in Boca, where we have very expensive homes, the dirt that they're sitting on is cheap because they're far, far away from the water. They're far away from Boca itself. They're out in the former agricultural preserve, which the tax collector of Palm Beach County has figured that they can make a lot more money by making $1 million houses than growing bell peppers out there on 441. All right, and next slide. Let's see if we can tackle a more difficult question. This one came at the request of the chief. She wanted me to find and explain the degree to which, multiple choice. And although there is not a verbatim explain the degree to which, this kind of fits the bill because it talks about Costa Rica protecting 25% of its land. And this is interesting because how would you rate that in terms of a degree? 25% doesn't sound like a lot when you consider that you could certainly preserve more than that. But when you compare that to other countries around the world, 25% is a significant portion of territory to set aside. Hold on, my little timer's going off because I didn't want to go over my time limit. The chief knows when I get talking, you might not ever get me to stop. So when you look at this question, this is a bit of that degree to which, and it says, what's the desired effect of this for Costa Rica? And this is one of those where we know that students may struggle with this because there's a little bit of background information. The question stem provides some of that information for the student. And so basically what we're looking for here is the student should recognize that Costa Rica is one of those countries very famous for ecotourism, for the idea of stimulating money spent by tourists to promote and sustain not just the environmental aspect, because after all, you got to preserve that environment if you want those tourists to keep coming, but also for that money to be injected into the local economy and to provide a way of development that's not necessarily dependent on, say, industrialization or commercial agriculture, something to that effect. All right. Nicole, can you take me one more step? So, and you could go ahead if you want and drop all of these bullet points down, because I'll go quickly through these. 3 big ideas that I really feel like I wanted to ask you guys to share with your students. And that is, again, going back into the CED, take a look at those essential knowledge statements. And those are the things that you see on the right-hand side of each page on the topic pages. All of our items are coming basically from those EK statements. As I like to tell my kids, the left-hand side of the topic page oftentimes could be phrased as a question because it's where the verbs are: the describe, the explain, the compare, the identify, the define. And those EKs on the right side are often the answers to those verbs that are being tasked to the student. So the more your kids can see practice questions, and that could be any of the review books that are out there. It could be on AP Classroom, the progress checks that are available there. It can be on any of the study apps, you know, iScore5. It could be on the Fiveable website. It can be wherever they choose to find these practice questions. Kids always scratch their head when I say this. I always tell them, everything you miss now is a good thing because it identifies areas where you can improve. So we need to know what you don't know in order to help you start to figure out how you can study and how you can be better prepared. So I always tell my students, the more questions they see, that's a good thing. We do that in class, and you know, most teachers will try, if you're fortunate, get done in enough time where you can start having some review time. Your exam's on a Thursday this year, and today is Thursday, by the way. So you have 3 more Thursdays before the exam. So hopefully the kids are getting an opportunity to practice. As we kind of talked about ad nauseum there, emerging, proficient, advanced level of difficulty. Again, those are relatively evenly spread out throughout the test, about 20 of the emerging, 20 of the proficient, 20 of the advanced. And again, it stuns me. I always used to ask my students this: how many of the emerging questions should you get right? And they would say, I don't know, 16, 17. No, all 20 of them. They're the easiest 20 questions on the exam. And then you might get 17 or so of the moderately difficult. And listen, of those hardest 20, it'd be great if you could get to 50-50 and get 10 of them right. And if you add that up, 20 plus about 17 plus about 10 more. Hey, you're suddenly scoring in the high 40s, low 50s. Guess what, kids? You're going to get an outstanding score on the AP Human Geography exam. So we need kids to practice and again, I think desensitize them a little bit. I know some teachers will even read the exam day instructions so that kids can kind of have an idea of what test day is going to look like and feel like, and they can be a little better prepared. And my last little part here is about timing. Again, every question counts the same. The easiest question on the test counts the same as the hardest question on the test. When students spend an inordinate amount of time grinding and struggling on that difficult question, you know what the research suggests? They're probably going to get it wrong. So it's not really in your best interest to spend a ton of time on any one item. If you don't know it, make an educated guess and move on. It's better to get one question wrong than to miss 10 questions at the end of the test because you only got to number 51 and the proctor said, that's time, put your pencils down. So again, try this with your kids, share some of these ideas with them because this will help them boost their score. And after all, that's what we all want. All right, I think that's it for me. That means that it's time for Annalisa.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. My name is Annalisa Dahlgren, and I teach 9th grade AP Human Geography in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, which is a suburb of Madison. You can advance the slide. And I'm here to talk a little bit more about the review activities you might do with your students in these short weeks leading up to the exam. I think as we wrap our brains around review, it's so important to know that students need to do more than just drill Quizlets. And as much as they love clicking through the Quizlet, they really have to think based on what we've heard the previous presenters talk about. We know students will see FRQs that cross units. We know that they'll see multiple choice questions and free response questions that ask them to interpret stimuli and apply content and make connections and make comparisons. So I'd like to talk about some strategies for reviewing content and practicing skills and then building up student confidence in the weeks leading up to the exam. Go ahead and click to the next slide. The first piece I want to share is some content review, and this is hexagonal thinking. You can do this in a Jamboard or in Google Slides or on paper. And what I do is I insert an image of a hexagon pattern from Google Images, and then I insert Post-its with words or terms that we're practicing with to review. The idea is then to place the terms in an arrangement where shared sides indicate some kind of relationship or connection. And then I have students use arrows to draw attention to the intersections that are most logical or most interesting or most unexpected. Flip ahead to the next slide, and here's an example of what it looks like when a student completes this activity. I've used this with small groups or individuals. The terms can be contained within a chapter or a unit or stretched across chapters and units. You can crowdsource the terms, have one class come up with the terms that you're giving to the next class, or hand pick the terms that you know your students have struggled with during the year. Flip to the next slide for one more example. I like to use Jamboard, but you can also do this on paper. And a quick shortcut is to use squares of paper. It's not quite hexagons, but it's a lot quicker to cut out. And then students use glue and organize the ideas in a sequence with shared relationships and use Post-its to justify the connections. So that's one way that I have students review and remember the topics we talked about back in October, and it feels like a lifetime ago, but getting those ideas back on the top of their brain and thinking beyond just the definitions. All right, flip to the next slide. And I also build in opportunities for students to review in a way that works for them. Because I teach 9th grade, my students need some trial and error to figure out what study strategies work for them as a learner. And these are the strategies they'll continue using in challenging classes throughout high school. So one example of that is I use the big ideas packet that I got from the AP Facebook group. And then each student gets a packet and they're responsible for showing evidence of how they use the packet for review. But that can look different for every student. So some students highlight, some make flashcards, some underline, some draw in the margins, some use those Post-it flags. Whatever works for them is what is acceptable as a review strategy. I extrapolate that same approach as we review content. So you need to review something from Unit 2, but you choose if you watch a Mr. Sin video or do an AP classroom progress check or review your reading guide from the unit. Whatever is going to make the learning stick in your brain is fine, and that can be different than the friend next to you. Okay, flip to the next slide. I also rely on visual reviews. Because so much of the test relies on stimuli, how can I help students continually make pictures in their brains of what we're studying? So many of the topics in our course can be reviewed using images and sketches or drag and drop functions. So students might draw the concentric zone model or drag and drop economic sectors or annotate the DTM. And this can be electronic or tactile. So here are some Jamboard or Google drawing examples, or tactile with chalk on the sidewalk. whatever might motivate your students to buy into the review. The more they buy in, the more they will learn and the more their classmates will learn too. Okay, flip ahead, please. I also purposely build in opportunities in class to review the skills explicitly that you heard Kevin and Lisa talk about. For example, my students will complete partner FRQs where they really focus on pushing each other to write detailed answers according to what the task verbs are asking. I have them alternate writing by sentences. So write a sentence, pass the paper to your partner, write a sentence, pass it back. And then they peer score the writing that their classmates did. We'll also do some small group multiple choice practice. Like Kevin said, if you haven't used the test questions from AP Classroom, that's a great place to start. And other resources would be things like iScore5 or Albert if you have access to those for just a lot of multiple choice practice. Okay, flip ahead, please. Remembering how critical stimuli are, it is also important to analyze the key maps from each unit to review the spatial patterns. Analyzing maps gives us an entry point to review the Unit 1 skills like map scale and scale of analysis. We can also use map practice and map analysis to discuss the limitations of maps and the key spatial takeaways as we do this visual review. All right, next slide, please. I also find ways for my students to live and breathe geography, especially in those 2 weeks leading up to the exam. I want them to see that geography is everywhere, and that's what makes this class so amazing. They can truly internalize what we're learning because they see it all day long. A review activity we use is to purposely make connections and observations about geography in our community. So we look unit by unit and we see where the topics are in Sun Prairie, the community where I teach. And then students can use Google Image or screen grabs or photos from their camera roll to highlight how the topics that we've learned about are truly all around them. And then on the next slide, we even go further than just identifying. We also practice defining and explaining and describing using specific visible thinking routines to evaluate what we've learned in our community. I've done a similar activity with my students before the exam on GroupMe, which is a text messaging app, and they blast messages, pictures of where they see human geography terms in their daily life so that they're always thinking about it beyond just when we're in class. The big idea is that human geography is something that lives, it isn't something that lives just in our classroom or in our textbook, but it is everywhere. And students can review as they go about their daily lives if they're being observant about what they see. Okay, then I have one other topic. Finally, I do want to talk about how I use an AP Human Geography mentor program to build community between students. This can be really small scale, just over the next few weeks, or it can be something year-long, which is what I choose to do. Over the summer, I invite former students to be mentors for this next year's class. They fill out a brief application, but I'll be honest that anyone who applies gets accepted. Because I teach AP Human Geography to 9th grade students, I have an eager supply of 10th, 11th, and 12th graders who really want to be mentors to 9th grade students. And I leverage their expertise and teen voice in a variety of ways. They film Flipgrids and offer messages of advice or support to my current students. They may also justify how specific things we do in class, like that big ideas packet, may feel really tenuous or weird or tedious while we're doing it, but it's actually really helpful and meaningful. Right now, my mentors are in the process of filming some Flipgrid videos to offer advice, specifically about how to prepare for the upcoming exam. And we know how important that is when it comes from a teenager's voice instead of my voice. I also have a separate Google Classroom page for the mentors where I ask them specific questions and share their responses with my current students. But the best part of the mentor program is live study sessions. We meet once a week on Zoom in the evening time, and different mentors join as they're able to in their very busy schedules. We play games, we do jam boards, and the mentors lead small group review sessions. And it is so powerful to have older high school students give advice about a range of topics. how to study, how to review the lessons they learned from class, and recommendations on what classes to take next year. Through the mentor program, ninth grade students also build really valuable academic connections with older students while preparing for their AP exam. And like I said, this can be a short-term program, just a few sessions led by former students on Zoom if you have them, or a more formalized year-long program, but it really packs a punch for my students to help them learn and love geography. All right, I just have one more slide. Ultimately, we want students to have confidence going into their AP exam. I live in ninth grade, and so for my students, this is their first AP exam, and my guess is others of you may teach ninth grade as well. So we need to do what we can to help students feel comfortable taking this first exam. Many of my students are taking this exam before they've taken their driver's test. So they don't understand how big this test feels for them. And so what tools can I give them to wrap their brain around it? I think demystifying the exam, like what Kevin said, being very clear about the parts of the exam, the experience of taking the exam, to remove these environmental unknowns for the students so that they know what's going to happen when they get to the exam is really important. And by watching this webinar live or recorded, you're already really starting to think through that. I also remind my students that in this final month, we're all working together as a team to take on the task of, at least for my students, their first AP exam. It's all of us together. It's not a competition. And I'm just so excited to celebrate with them when they complete this exam just a month from now. So best wishes to you and your students as we move into review time.
Indeed. Yeah. Best wishes to all the students and the teachers preparing their students to pass and get through this exam. I would say this is a powerhouse. Thank you so much, Dr. Lisa. Thank you so much, Miss Lisa. Thank you so much, Kevin. This webinar is going to be shared. It will definitely be on our YouTube channel, but we're also going to make an effort and send it out to everybody that registered for this webinar. I know that many registered and haven't been able to make it. We'll make sure that we extend these resources, and we would love to have all your feedback on the different things that we can improve. I've picked a lot of ideas from what the three panelists have shared, and I really believe that AGS will get deep down into them and enhance one of those all too. So fingers crossed. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Good luck to you and your students.
Yes.